event, Courage from Atrocity to Safety, as we mark Refugee Week. Refugee Week is the world's largest arts and cultural festival, celebrating the contributions, creativity, and resilience of refugees and people seeking sanctuary. My name is Mia Hassenson-Gross, and I'm the Executive Director of Renee Kassan, the host organization. Our mission, grounded in Jewish teachings, Jewish dignity and values, and the community's historical experiences, is to promote and protect universal rights in the UK, especially as they affect other marginalized and minority groups in the UK. We operate at the intersection of community mobilization, narrative change, and policy advocacy. We draw our inspiration from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, co-drafted by our namesake, Monsieur René Cassin, in response to the horrors of the Holocaust. The declaration was the first expression of a global commitment to protect human dignity, demand accountability, and act when others need protecting. We believe that as survivors of intolerance, discrimination, and persecution, we have a uniquely authoritative voice in speaking out when other groups are affected. This year marks 10 years since the systematic genocide of Uyghur people in East Turkestan started, during which millions of Uyghurs are in mass detention, suffering from forced labor, religious persecution, forced sterilization, organ harvesting, and the separation of over 1 million children from their parents. Uyghurs in the diaspora suffer from transnational repression, targeting journalists, activists, former detainees, and their family members. In Sudan, Darfur continues to experience intense fighting within Sudan's civil war, with widespread violence against civilians, including killings and ethnic targeting, raising warnings of possible genocide. At the same time, the region faces a catastrophic humanitarian crisis with mass displacement, severe hunger, and very limited access to aid. And here in the UK, our asylum system does not currently offer safe, humane, and fair pathways for those fleeing persecution. Earlier this year, René Cassin made a submission to the UK Standing Group on Atrocity Crimes, arguing that refugee protection, established exactly 75 years ago next month in the form of the Refugee Convention, should be central to preventing atrocities, emphasizing that states have both the legal and moral duty under the Convention to provide safe routes for those fleeing persecution. Our submission calls on the UK to embed this approach into atrocity prevention strategy by expanding safe pathways, creating humanitarian corridors, and committing to resettlement. These measures aim to ensure a proactive, coordinated, and humane response grounded in international law. I am delighted to introduce our speakers for today's event, who have courageously agreed to share their personal experiences of surviving atrocities and their journeys to safety, and to highlight some of the key challenges faced by refugees and asylum seekers in the UK today. Hamidullah Vali is an Uyghur religious scholar and refugee advocate. After his own experience of detention, ill treatment, and the threats of forced return to China. In November of last year, Hamidullah finally reached safety in the UK, where he is seeking asylum. Abdullah Idris Abu Garda leads the Darfur Diaspora Group, Association Group in the UK, and the advocacy efforts to address impunity for the crimes committed in Sudan, including engagement with the International Criminal Court to raise awareness of the Darfur crisis. Beth Gardiner-Smith is a senior policy fellow at the UK think tank Future Governance Forum and the founder and former CEO of the international NGO Safe Passage International. I would also like to introduce Rahima Mahmoud, Executive Director of Stop Uyghur Genocide UK, who has kindly who will be interpreting for Hamidullah today. So a bit of housekeeping just before I invite Hamidullah to share his story. We will first hear from the speakers and then move on to a moderated discussion, at which point you will be able to type your questions or raise a hand, and we will enable you to ask your question. And as you've noted, this event is being recorded. So it is my great pleasure to invite Hamidullah to please unmute yourself and share your story of courage with us.
Assalamu alaikum, Hamdullah hacım. Əmdi sözünü sizge bədi. Siz özünüzdeki bayanınızdan başlasanız buldu. Mən bir qancha cümleden kin tərcüm qılma. Siz Uyghur sözləysiz, onunki mən yəni tərcüm qılma. Aşağı başlayımız. Olamdı?
Buldu. Maqul. Rahmet. Salam köpçülük. Mən avval özümni biraz tanıştırıp ötey. Mən Şərqi Türkistanның Turpan şəhərindən, yəni Çin işğaliyetidəki Uyğurlar rayonundakı Turpan şəhərindən özüm ticaretçi. Bu chet elga chiqib qilish, chet elga chiqib bu musafir bo'lishimning sababi 2004-yildan boshlab Urumchi shahriga chiqib tijorat qildim. Tijorat qilish jarayonida 2010-yildan 2014-yilgacha bo'lgan jarayonda nurg'un mushaqqatchiliklarga, zo'ravonliklarga uchirdim. Shu sabab bilan oxiri pasport olib chet elga chiqish niyatiga keldim va 2016da chet elga chiqdim.
To'xtang, siz butunlay qisqartib aytdingiz.
Buni bir tarjima qilib bersangiz, men tafsilotini keyin deyman.
Tamam, bo'ldi. Chunki men sizning deganingiz bo'yicha tarjima qilishni qilgan. Greetings, everyone. First of all, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Hamdullah Bali. I am from Turpan in East Turkestan, which remains under Chinese rule. Before fleeing my homeland, I was a businessman. The experience that eventually forced me into exile began many years ago. From 2004 onwards, I ran a clothing business in Urumchi. My business was relatively successful, but the pressure and the persecution from Chinese authorities grew steadily worse. And let me just share some examples. Hem 2010-yıldan tartib başlasanız bo'ladi.
Men bundan da 2010-yildan tartib bo'lgan ishlarni bir qur bayon qilib o'tay qisqacha. 2010-yili 12 kun turmaga so'ladi. 13 kunlik turma hayotimdagi hech qanday jinoyat yo'q. Sabab 2010-yildagi turmada yetishimning sababi 98-yil, ya'ni 12 yil ilgari yanımda qassoblik qilgan vaqtimda yanımda pichoq olib yuribdi ekanmishman. Shu 2010-yildagi Uyg'urlar endi pichoq saqlash, pichoq olib yurish, tig'liq asbob olib yurish jinoyat degan qonuniga xilof bo'lganligi uchun 12 yilning oldidagi shu ish uchun 12 kun turmada yotdim.
Tamam, o'shni men tarjima qilay. In 2010, I was imprisoned for the first time. The reason was ridiculous. 12 years earlier, in 1998, I had worked as a butcher, and like any butchers carried a knife as part of my work. In 2010, the authorities introduced regulations prohibiting Uyghurs from possessing bladed items. They claimed that my possession of a knife 12 years earlier somehow violated this regulation and detained me for 12 days. 13 gün so'ldi. Hamda
Yani
2013-dan boshlaysiz.
Hamda 2012 yılı meniki ticaretki mal mülkümni meniki e, 2012'de bir qatım, 2013'de bir qatım barlıq mal mülkümni eketdi. Umum mal mülkümnün sommasi 500 ming so'mdan aşıdı şu zamanda. Şunçilik mal mülkümni Çin hükümeti bulab ketdi. Hech qanday sababsiz uningga aningdekilki tuturuqsiz bahanimi yo'q. Faqatlam shu ap ketdi. Buningga hech bir nima yo'q. Shuna
In
qilib o'ldirdi.
2012 and 2013, I suffered further persecution, and the government, the authorities, confiscated goods and from my business, which worth more than 500,000 Chinese currency yuan. For that, I wasn't given any explanation. Basically, they robbed me. Endi başlasanız bo'ldi.
2013'ning oxiri 2014'ning 5'ida yana bir oy turmaga sulidi. Bunun sebebi faqat menda 2009'da yani 4 yıl burun bir ayal bir necha ay ishlab chiqayotgan shu ayolning eri bir jinoyatga chetishib qolibdiki, shu ayolni shu erning qilgan ishini bilamsa deb so'rgan savoli shu bo'ldi. Men u ayolning menikidan chiqayotgandan keyin nima ish qilganini qo'l ostimda ishlagan, lekin qo'l ostimda chiqayotgandan keyin nima ish qilganini men nima bilay. U ayolnikin bilmasam, yernikin qandoq bilma dedim. Shuning bilan meni urib yerda u nimada ayrim nimada so'raganda u qilib ketdi, lekin uni u ishlar hech kim ko'rmagan. Men boshqalar ko'rgan vaqtning ahvolini deb beray. Bu
Tarjima qilib o'tay.
ha.
Then in early 2014, I was imprisoned again, this time detained for a month. The reason was even more unbelievable. 4 years earlier, in 2009, a woman had briefly worked for me. Her husband later became implicated in a case and was arrested. So the police came to me and arrested me, asking me about the connection that I had with the man. I told them that I barely knew the woman's husband, and it's not possible for me to know anything about him. However, I was interrogated and being beaten during my time in detention.
Ondan keyin bu ommaviy kamerada boshqalar bilan yotgan vaqtimdagi ahvolni deb beray. U hamma odam ko'rgan, qolganlar butun qish vaqtisi bizning Urumchi bak sovuq bo'ladi. 0 tuvan 30 necha gradus sovuq. Shu sovuqda boshqalarga qalin kiyim berdi, lekin menga ich kiyim bilan putumda to'shay. Şunun bilan muzning ustida kunda 3,5 soat, kunduz vaqti sirtda muzning tubida 3,5 soat turishim kerak. Putumda kishal, qo'limda ko'yza, hammasi zanjirlar bilan bog'liqlik. Mushu holatda bir oyni ashundoq o'tkazdim.
I suffered extreme torture, and there was a time that I was punished when temperature fell below 30 degrees, and they forced me to stand outside wearing only my underwear. I was chained and shackled. I had a handcuff, and I was made to stand on ice for 3.5 hours. And most of other prisoners received thick, proper winter clothing, but didn't receive any.
Keyin şunu hech qanday bir ishqa, hech qanday bir narsaga atadiganға, hech qanday bir uyuch bo'lmaganligi uchun menda hech qanday bir jinoyatning nimasi, hatto bir jinoyatchini bildigan, o'qidigan, ishini bildigan bir jinoyatini emas, boshqa kasbini bildigan ishim bo'lmaganligi uchun shuning bilan bir oydan keyin qo'yib bergandan keyin men shu bir oy jarayonida bularning faqat bizni yo'qotish, o'ttirishlar maqsadi borligini bildim. Shuning bilan tijorat qildirsa qilsa qilg'il qo'ymadi. Hadisi akirib aningdek o'ttirdiganning amali bo'lgandan keyin shuning bilan sirtga chiqib ketishning amalini qildim.
In the
2014
end, they didn't find any evidence against me and I was released. But that experience made me to believe that there is no peace for me. I cannot carry on my business and they can find any reason to detain and torture me. So I began to look for a way to obtain a passport and leave the country. In early 2016, I managed to secure a passport and leave the country.
ikki yil yo'l menish orqali 2016 yilning 5-ida pasportga erishdim va Turkiyaga keldim. Turkiyaga kelgandan keyin Turkiyada boshqa Uyg'ur korxonachilarining qo'l ostida ishladim. Turmushimni yomon emas o'tdi. Va yana Turkiyaning uzun doimlik iqomatiga uningga erishdim.
So after securing a passport, after 2 years, I finally traveled to Turkey, and that was the start of my life in exile. And after arriving in Turkey in February 2016, I worked for Uyghur-owned businesses and slowly rebuilt my life. And I had the Turkish long-term residency there.
2020-yili Uyg'urlarga Saudiya Arabistonga boradiganға viza tasdiqladi. Shu sabab bilan men 1 yillik viza bilan Saudiya Arabistoniga haj ibodat uchun bordim.
In 2020, I secured a visa, a 1-year visa to Saudi Arabia. And so in 2020, I traveled to Saudi Arabia.
Saudiyaga bu berishim mening bir cho'ng bir Xitoy hukumatining bir tuzug'iga dastiga ish bo'ldi.
Looking back, it was a decision that changed the course of my life.
Saudiya Arabistonga borgandan keyin uzun o'tmay bu korona mezgillarida korona sabablik yo'llar taqaldi. Saudiya Arabistondan chiqib ketolmadik. Shuning bilan Saudiya Arabistonda turib qolishga majbur bo'ldim. 4 oy uydan chiqmay yotdik. 4 oydan keyin kontrol biroz bo'shidi. Orqadan masjidga chiqib namoz o'qib kirgidek imkoniyatlar bo'ldi.
Shortly after I arrived, the COVID pandemic spread across the world and the international travel came to a standstill. It became impossible for me to return to Turkey. For months, we were effectively confined to confined indoors.
Turkiyaga masjidga chiqib namoz o'qigudek bo'lgandan keyin shu kunlarda bir kechasi eshigim jiddiy qaqildi. Ishni ochsam bir 90 yoshlar chamasidagi bir qari odam bu eshik oldida turibdi. Ishni ochdim, kirdi. Kirib ishni taqadim. Uy kirib naytda ansirgan ovozda menga qulog'imga yaqin kelib, bu seni Xitoy hukumati olib ketgili vatudo Saudiya hukumati bilan kelishib bo'ldi. 3 gün içinde seni ağıl kelidi, muşunu xabar qilib qo'yg'ili keldim dedi va ketdi.
Soon after the restrictions was relaxed, so we started going to pray in mosques. One night, there was a sudden knock at my door. It was after midnight. When I opened it, an elderly man stepped inside, and he told me, after closing the door, quietly, and he said, China wants you back. The Saudi authorities have already reached an agreement, and within 3 days, they will come to arrest you. And then he left as suddenly as he had arrived. Davamlaştırsanız boldu.
2 günden saqçı geldi. Ben aldın ala xabari bo'lganligi uchun bu saqçı mening uyimga kelgan vaqtda men uyga kirmaylam, qochdim. Shuning bilan riyodga berib xalqaro kishilik huquq o'rniga, inson haqlari o'rniga ularga ahvolni ma'lum qildim. U yerdan qaytib kelib Nur Muhammed Rozi ismlik bizning Sharqiy Turkistonlik bir odamning uyiga kirib, shuning uyida panolandim. Qayta burungi uyga kirmadim. Shuning bilan har qaysi davlatlardagi butun Uyg'ur faoliyatchilariga mening davoyimni qilsanglar, mushu meni qaysi davlatlar mushu chin qaytilib ketishimdan buzib olsa, meni bossam o'ldirdi, o'ldirgandan qiynab ketadi, mushunga yordam qilsanglar dedim.
Tamam.
Qaysi faoliyatchilar obdan yordam qildi, qaysi davlatlarmi jiq kuch chiqadi.
To'xtab turing. 2 days, men tarjima qilib o'tay. 2 days later, the police came looking for me. Because I had been warned, I managed to escape. I immediately went to a human rights organization in Riyadh and explained my situation. Afterwards, I found refuge in the home of a man named Nur Muhammed Rozi from East Turkestan. While hiding there, I appealed through WhatsApp and other social media to Uyghur activists and telling them my situation, asking them to reach out to organizations and other countries to secure my safety. I said if I were taken back, not only death, but the worst is the torture, and I am afraid, so I need your help. Uyghur activists started worked tirelessly and did everything they could to help me.
Bu xalqaro jamiyatning qarshiligiga qaramay Saudiya hukumati 2020-yil 11-oyda meni ham menga panolik bergan Nur Muhammed Rozini qo'lga oldi.
Despite significant international pressure, the Saudi authorities arrested both me and Nur Muhammed Rozi, the man who had given me shelter in November 2020.
2022 kelgan vaqtda bizni shu chaqchilik yo'qlab turgan Xadija xonimni va uning qizini bizning bilan qo'shib qaytarish uchun unanimi turmaga qamadi.
In 2022, a woman named Khadija who visited both of us for the past 2 years, and she was arrested along with her 12-year-old daughter. And the authority intended to deport all of us back to China.
Şu halatda korkunuş içinde, endiş içinde 5 yıl hayatımız Saudi'nin türmüsüde öttü. Bizne hele kaytıramı, bize keyin kaytıramı dep muşunun bilen endişelerle öttü. Bunu e, halkara cemiyetinin yardım bilen ötken yılı April'da türmüden çıktık ve Türkiye'ye geldik.
The next 5 years in Saudi prison were filled with fear, uncertainty, and anxiety. Every day we lived with possibility that we could be forcibly returned to China. Finally, in April 2025, we were released and allowed to travel to Turkey.
Türkiye'ye kelişimizge yardım kılgan hakaysi faaliyetçilerge bizden kaytırlık etmişimizge Uygur faaliyetçiler olsun Amerika hükümeti, Avrupa kişilik hukuk, halkara keşirim teşkilatı hakaysi muşu bizden aşu Xitay kaytırlık bitiştin qoğdap qalğan, muşunun üçün küç çıqarğan, hem tilek taşıған hemme kişilerge teşekkürümü bildirimen.
I would like to express my deepest gratitude to everyone who helped secure our release and prevented our deportation, including Amnesty International, human rights organizations, and many other democratic countries that advocated on our behalf.
Türkiye'ye kelgenden keyin Türkiye'de üzemni bexatar his qılanmadım. Yana bu Xitay hükümetinin mafiyan ishga silib meni qaslab qo'yishidan ansirab yana yerda xotirjam bo'lolmay o'tgan yil 10 oyda Turkiyadan ayrilib qochoq bu Fransiyaga keldim ming jafo bilan. Nurg'un jafo tortdim, daryolardan o'tdik, tog'dan o'tdik, qor kechdik, muz kechdik degandek qishda 11 oyda shundoq jafo bilan bu Fransiyaga keldik. Fransiyadan bot bilan bu Angliyaga o'tgan bo'ldik. Hozir bu yerda shu nimani siyosiy panohlik tildim. Bu yerdan hozir shu Qobulning chiqishini saqlab turyapman.
Even after returning to Turkey, I still did not feel safe. So on 7th of October 2025, I left Turkey and traveled to Bosnia. From there, I crossed mountains and rivers, enduring immense hardship and danger as I made my way through irregular immigration routes into France. Eventually, I crossed the Channel by boat and arrived in the United Kingdom, where I applied for asylum. And today I am still waiting for the decision on my asylum case. God willing, I hope to receive a positive outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamidullah, for sharing really your story of courage. I just want to say that just this weekend, Rahima and I attended an international conference on the Uyghurs and the extent of Chinese transnational repression is immense. So what Hamidullah is describing, both in terms of what you experienced back in East Turkestan and later on, once you were able to leave, is a reality that is experienced by so many Uyghurs today. But thank you, Hamidullah. It is now my privilege to invite Abdallah to please share your story with everyone about your journey and what's happening back home in Darfur. Abdallah, please.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I would like to begin by thanking Ryan Cussing for organizing this important event during Refugee Week, for creating a space where refugee voices can be heard. I am honored to join you today and to share my personal experience, which reflect the experience of many others who flee violence, persecution, and the human rights abuse. The title of today's event, Courage from Atrocity to Safety, is deeply meaningful to me because it reflects a journey that millions of the refugees across the world have been forced to take. I come from Darfur, a region where a region in Western Sudan that has suffered decades of conflict, violence, mass displacement, and genocide. Like many others, I witnessed devastating consequences of conflict and persecution. Communities were destroyed, families were separated, and many innocent people lost their life simply because of who they were and where they live. Fear and uncertainty become a part of everyone's life. The journey from conflict is the journey from conflict to safety is not really easy. It is often dangerous, uncertain, and traumatic. Many refugees spend years moving from one place to the another in searching of protection and dignity. Throughout this journey, they carry not only the physical burden of the displacement, but also the emotional scare of what they have endured. When I arrived into the United Kingdom, I was grateful to find safety for many refugees. For many refugees, Britain represent hope, democracy, human rights, and rule of the law. It is a country with a proud tradition of the offering protection to those who flee persecution and genocide. However, reaching safety does not mean that the challenge suddenly disappears. Many refugees arrive carrying deep trauma from the war and the violence. They must adapt to the new culture, new language, and a completely different society. They often struggling with loyalty, uncertainty, and concern about the family member who remain in dangerous situation. The asylum process itself can also be extremely difficult. Long waiting period can leave people in the limbo for the months or even years. During this time, individuals may experience stress and anxiety and uncertainty about their future. We have witnessed a significant number of the refugee and the asylum seeker from Sudan experiencing mental difficulty, including anxiety and depression. Those conditions are often linked to explosion or to the armed conflict, displacement, and the loss of the family member. Social isolation, financial hardship, and uncertainty surrounding the asylum process. Many refugees want nothing more than contribute positively to the society. They want to work, study, support their family, and become active members of their community. Yet, barriers within the system can make this difficult. This is why discussions about improving the asylum system are so important. We need a system that's fair, efficient, human, and grounded in the respect for the human dignity. We need safe and accessible pathway for the people fleeing persecution so they do not have to risk their life in the searching of protection. Throughout history, refugees have contributed hugely to the country that welcomed them, and they have become a doctor, teacher, engineer, business owner, artist, community leader, and public servants. Given the opportunity, refugees contribute not only economically, but also culturally and socially. Today, this message is especially important. We are living in a time when public debate around migration has become increasingly polarized. Recent tension in Belfast and in London and elsewhere remind us that the fear and the division can sometimes overshadow understanding and the compassionate. Before I continue, I would like to express my sincere sympathy and solidarity with the victim and the family affected by the recent tragic incident in Belfast and London. Violence against innocent people is always unacceptable, regardless of who committed. As someone who has witnessed consequences of violence and conflicts and genocide, I believe that every victim deserves compassionate justice and support. At the same time, we must be careful not to allow action of the individual to fuel hostility toward entire community. Refugee and the asylum seeker should be judged as individuals, just like everyone else. Collective blame only deepen division and undermine the value of the fairness and the justice that we all share. Refugee Week provided us with opportunity to challenge misconception and to hear directly from those who live whose life has been shaped by displacement. Personal story have the power to build bridge where the fear create barriers. When people hear the experience of the refugee, they often discover that our hopes are the same. We want security for our family. We want opportunity for the children. We want dignity, freedom, and the chance to live in the peace. As chair of the Darfur Diaspora Association in the United Kingdom, I have the privilege of working with members of our community who continues to support one another while also contributing to the British society. Despite the hardship they have faced, I continue to inspire by others' resilience, fortitude, and determination. However, while we gather here today, millions of the people in Sudan continue to endure one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Since the outbreak of the current conflict, many civilians have been killed, injured, displaced, and prevented of the access to the food, healthcare, basic food, and the genocide and the ethnic cleansing in Al-Fasher. Also in Darfur, community have once again faced horrific violence, including attack of the civilian, ethnic targeting, and the destruction of entire town and the village, and again genocide, due war. Many survivors who arrive in the United Kingdom carry fresh memory of the atrocity that should have no place in the 21st century. Their story reminds us that struggling for the safety and the dignity continues. As a member of the Darfur Diaspora Association, our work extends beyond supporting refugee and asylum seekers in the United Kingdom. We also advocate for justice, accountability, and the protection of the human rights in anywhere, in particular in Sudan. We believe that lasting peace cannot be achieved without justice and equality and accountability. We continue to call for independent investigation, into the crime committed against the civilian in Sudan and for those responsible for the war crime, crime against humanity, and genocide to be held accountable. Justice is not about the revenge, it is about the protection of the human dignity, acknowledging the suffering of the victims and the help to prevent in the future atrocity. The international community must not also away from the suffering of the Sudanese people. Silence and the impunity only encourage further violation, as is transferred from Darfur to the whole Sudan right now. We must stand with survivors, support humanitarian effort, and uphold the principle that no one is above the law. The legacy of the Ryan Casing reminds us that the human rights are universal. They belong to everyone, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, religion, and or immigration status. The principle that underpin human rights are most meaningful when they apply to those who need protection the most. I would like to conclude with the simple message: refugees are not defined by the atrocity they have survived. They are defined by their courage, resilience, and fortitude to rebuild their life. Every refugee carries a story. Behind every asylum application is a human being. Behind every statistic is a family, a dream, and the future. If we listen to those stories, if we uphold our shared value of the humanity and the justice, and if we work together to create fair and a compassionate system, then we can help transform journey of the suffering into the journey of the hope. And we have the audacity of the hope. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your solidarity. And thank you for the commitment to protecting human rights. And we are grateful for this opportunity. And I would like to also thank again for the Ryan Casing for this opportunity to exchange our idea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abdallah. And Reneka-san has worked very closely with the Darfur Diaspora Association, a great partner, and we will continue to do that. So your story and every single individual story you mentioned gets the hopeful outcome that it deserves. Beth, Abdallah said the UK stands for hope, human rights, democracy, rule of law. But I have a feeling you're gonna set some facts around how that manifests itself or not through our asylum system. So please.
Thank you. And look, it's thanks for inviting me today to speak, and it's a particular privilege to speak after Hamdullah and Abdallah have just spoken, and to hear such powerful testimony of what it means to both be a victim of persecution, but also the courage that comes in so many of those stories too. So it's a real privilege to speak in Refugee Week after both of those speakers and at this Lunch and Learn today. So yes, I am going to I'm going to take us out of the sort of personal and talk a bit about the policy context and the political context today. And I want to speak about the UK, but I'll also, I think, talk about what it means this year to be approaching the 75th anniversary of the signing of the Refugee Convention, as you said, Mia, which comes just next month. It's at the end of next month that we celebrate the signing of the Refugee Convention. And I will talk a bit about the risks that I believe the convention faces today, but more importantly, how I think we can start to overcome some of those risks.
I was reflecting this morning, it's interesting to have this event. It's an interesting coincidence that today the G7 conference is meeting in the town of Evian. And I think many people on this call will, or some people on this call will know that the small French town of Evian was the site of another conference 88 years ago in 1938. And that conference is very relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. And in illustrating why the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the Refugee Convention were so necessary, and what we risk in turning the clock back today. Just to remind people, on the eve of World War II, 32 countries met in the lakeside town of Evian to discuss what to do about the growing refugee crisis that was being caused by the persecution of Jews by Nazi Germany and the annexation of Austria at the time. And after 10 days of much discussion and despairing, only the tiny country of the Dominican Republic agreed to significantly increase its immigration quotas. They offered to admit up to 100,000 refugees who were fleeing persecution at the time. No other country gathered there after 10 days of discussion offered to do anything similar. And in the wake of World War II and the Holocaust, it was clear to the international community that in order to make good on the promise of never again, asylum must not be left to the discretion of countries to say whether they would admit or wouldn't admit people, but it must be protected as a fundamental human right. So I think, it's an interesting coincidence that the G7 is meeting in Evian today, given the significance of that historic conference. But before I talk more about the Refugee Convention, I will talk first a bit about the UK context. I don't think I probably need to talk a lot about or recap a lot for this audience, the political and policy landscape of today, but I will just say a few things about it. So, as we're told often, maybe every day at the moment, immigration is at the top of the public concerns when polled. And this is despite net migration being at a 14-year low. And pollsters largely cite concern over the arrival of asylum seekers by small boat as the sort of driving this overall concern amongst the public. And we have a political party promising mass deportation of settled immigrants, pulling out of the European Convention on Human Rights, and the banning of asylum claims in the UK, riding high at the top of the national polls. And we know that that party is the Reform Party at the moment. But we also have a Labour Home Secretary who has in recent months promised to replace the refugee status with temporary leave, allowing refugees only 30 months reprieve before their status is reviewed, up to a period of 20 years. And as many people know, citizenship has also been banned for any refugee who arrives by boat or lorry, which is the majority of those who claim asylum in the UK. And I think, as worrying, we've seen polling from British Future just published in the last week that shows that public sympathy for refugees arriving by small boat is falling, and that a majority of the public now say they're unsympathetic. So how did we in the UK, a country that Abdallah has said should represent democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and was so instrumental in the drafting of the Refugee Convention and the European Declaration on Human Rights, have we reached this point? I would talk a little bit about the UK policy decisions, but then I want to talk about the international context, and particularly ask some difficult questions about the asylum system today and the international protection system today. So I would say that we are in the midst of a political debate on migration that feels dangerously out of control at the moment. We have far-right influencers online and on our mainstream broadcasts and TV screens that are able to use terrible attacks like the one that Abdullah referenced that happened in Belfast just very recently, to incite racist pogroms against communities, whole communities of people. And we have mainstream political parties referring to asylum seekers now as illegal immigrants, which is totally wrong legally and factually, but also without thought to what that loaded language does to public perceptions of refugees and to our cohesive communities. And saying this is not to dismiss people's concerns about immigration. They are real and can be driven by direct experiences of a system that is fundamentally broken. The phenomenon of people arriving by small boat, asylum hotels, refugees spending years in the system waiting for a decision on their claim or on their appeal. The lack of ability to work and contribute at that, during that time. These are all very visible consequences of a system that is fundamentally broken and unfair. And the public realizes this. And many of us know what the solutions to these issues are. We need fundamental reform of asylum accommodation and support, moving away from the big providers and the big three providers. We need to end the use of asylum hotels and large site accommodation, which is inhumane and is driving a wedge within communities. We should be campaigning for asylum seekers to have the right to work and to contribute to their support here, and a faster and fairer asylum system and rebuilding of legal aid. And all these things, I think, probably people on this call all agree on. But I also want to challenge that if we did do all of those things, if a government did do all of those things, of course, it would go a long way to addressing public concern and improving outcomes in the system and improving the lives of refugees here. But I'm not sure that alone it would be enough to stop the erosion of support for asylum than the right to seek asylum itself that we're seeing. Irregular migration at the level of 40,000 people arriving a year by small boat is being instrumentalized by a far right to undermine trust in our liberal democracies, because it sort of represents for people this general sense that in a globalized and interconnected world, national governments are somehow powerless to control these big forces that are shaping our future. And the right is doing an incredible job of convincing publics, therefore, that our liberal democratic frameworks that were built to protect fundamental human rights against the most depraved outcomes of authoritarian power are in fact the enemy of the people. And this is the most incredible feat of what I'd call gaslighting by the far right. Once these views were once considered fringe, they are now mainstream political positions. And our governments have not helped, even governments that state that they support the right to seek asylum and the Refugee Convention, because in response to irregular migration, countries have increasingly imposed measures to restrict or prevent entry by refugees or others. Upstream interventions, border walls, collective expulsions, and even airline carrier sanctions that imposed by European countries to prevent people arriving here by visa or by airline and then claiming asylum. So if our political leaders tell us that they are doing everything possible to stop asylum seekers arriving in the UK, whether by boat, lorry or aeroplane, but then tell us that we should stand by the Refugee Convention, which permits asylum seekers to arrive irregularly, is it any wonder that public support in the UK for providing asylum is falling? But those of us who defend the refugee protection framework, I believe many of us have stopped making a convincing argument for why the system is as it is, but also how we can address the challenges of today. So I want to talk a bit about that before I close. So what does a convincing argument need? It needs an understanding of what we're trying to protect and achieve, and why it is worth protecting. It also needs, I think, to acknowledge how the context today has changed, and then provide a solution, a vision for the future that resolves some of those challenges. So what are we trying to protect? I don't think many political leaders today are capable of articulating why we have the system we do. But if we don't know what we're trying to protect, how can we defend it from those who want to rip it up? Our framework of international laws, beginning with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, co-authored by Reni Kassan, which established the individual right to seek asylum, emerged out of the international community's collective shame following World War II, when hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees and other refugees had been turned around at borders and denied sanctuary. Prior to 1948, protection was entirely dependent on each individual's country's discretion, at the expense of and excluding some of the most persecuted groups. We've talked about the Evian Convention, for example, to give you an example of Switzerland's border policies at the time during World War II, it allowed for the admission of political refugees, but barred entry to, quote, those who seek refuge on racial grounds, as, for example, Jews. So in the wake of the Holocaust, when the international community subsequently defined who had the right to seek asylum, it was clear that it must be based on a person's need of protection from persecution and not left to individual countries' discretion and often discrimination. And we often talk about the Kindertransport as a great moment in our national history, as it was, and when we allowed 10,000 unaccompanied children to come to the UK. But we don't so much talk about the fact that their parents or adult siblings were not also granted that same sanctuary. And this was a feature of the fact that the UK could decide who it admitted and who it didn't for protection. The government's current position of seeking effectively to end all asylum claims of people arriving by irregular route, but potentially in future open safe routes to specific groups, comes dangerously close to forgetting this fundamental lesson of history. Asylum is a legal right. Tailored schemes are often nationality specific and arbitrary. And in the case of Donald Trump's America, highly discriminatory. So I talk about Donald Trump's America at the moment. They effectively have ended the right to asylum in America. You cannot arrive and turn up at a border and claim asylum in the way you previously could. But they've created a new safe and legal route. But who's that safe and legal route for? Just one group at the moment, which is white Afrikaners. So the lesson of the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the reason why, the fundamental rights that we're enshrining within the Refugee Convention is that we must protect the individual right to seek asylum on the basis of a well-founded fear of persecution and not allow countries to deny asylum, but perhaps open up arbitrary safe routes for some favoured groups. But I do also think that we must acknowledge the challenges of today and how the world looks very different to the signatories of 1951 Convention. We have a globalized, interconnected world now, and the current system is not fair or humane. And we've heard the examples this morning of how the system does not work for refugees. We've sort of set up this kind of Hunger Games scenario where only those lucky enough who can pay or who can endure exploitation and avoid death along the route can seek asylum in the UK and countries like Europe, across Europe. And it's based on a multi-billion-dollar smuggling industry and these smugglers don't care whether somebody is a refugee or not, or whether somebody lives or dies en route. But the problem isn't about the right to seek asylum. The problem is that the international community has failed to define how those rights and obligations should be effectively implemented. And this actually dates back to the very drafting of the Refugee Convention. It was something, in fact, that the drafters realised as, in the process, how states should or could cooperate to implement their collective duty to provide asylum. So the French representatives initially proposed to address this in the preamble to the convention. They proposed wording that said, considering that the exercise of the right to asylum may result in an undue burden on certain countries and that a satisfactory solution of a problem of which the United Nations has recognised the international scope and nature cannot be achieved without international cooperation to help to distribute refugees throughout the world. But this acknowledgement was dropped. So the preamble simply states that effective implementation will rely on international cooperation. But over the years, attempts to share responsibility for the delivery of asylum effectively between states have fallen down. So we've had measures like the Global Compact on Refugees, but they've fallen far short. They've been voluntary and they've been grossly inefficient, both in their scale and ambition. But by staying silent on this question, we've seen smugglers and traffickers fill the void and establish their own system to facilitate access to asylum between countries. So, as you know, as those of us who wish to defend the Refugee Convention and the right to seek asylum, I believe that we need to tackle this, address this question head on, because it is undermining people's faith in the asylum system. So we know what we're trying to protect and what the challenges are to it, and I think the solutions therefore become clearer. And these are not the solutions that the right have. The right will like to burn it all down and go back to a scenario, of pre-1948. Our solutions, I think, have to demonstrate how we can deliver the right to asylum in a safer way, in a way that leans on international cooperation and is fairer. So one of the solutions I believe that we should be advocating for is the ability to apply for asylum, for refugees to be able to apply for asylum, as well as complementary pathways such as family reunion and community sponsorship from closer to the point of departure along migratory routes. So it's baffling in today's world that the only category of immigrant who cannot apply for a visa is an asylum seeker. And asylum seekers are instead required to make terrible journeys in order to seek asylum in a country in which they feel safe, or they can, they have members of their community or family. And we've seen examples of how a new system built on the right to apply for asylum upstream, closer to home, to countries like the UK can operate. So in the US, the previous Biden administration set up what were known as safe mobility offices in Latin America. And these were offices that were run by UNHCR and the US in cooperation with countries like Colombia, where refugees could arrive at the office and apply for asylum in the US, in America, and have their claim determined and considered there, and then essentially be given a visa to come to the US. And new technologies, the internet, it's opened up this opportunity to be able to deliver asylum in a different way that doesn't require people to take such a dangerous journey. But we need governments to be ambitious enough to deliver it. So we need in conjunction with that, I believe that we also need to be looking at how a new form international cooperation protocol that can help countries share responsibility for the world's refugees. So if we had a system where people could apply for asylum, from where they are, but apply for asylum in the UK or apply for asylum in other countries in Europe or elsewhere in the world, from where they are, the role of the UN could then become one where it is defining how many asylum seekers were assigned to different countries, and establish a responsibility sharing mechanism within the international community, so that we didn't have a situation where countries, low and middle income countries, are responsible for 85% of the world's refugees. So we are at 75 years, coming up to the 75th anniversary of the Refugee Convention. We have very few people today alive today who lived through the experiences that led to its creation. And its survival, I do believe, depends on generations today, believing that these legal articles and the principles they contain remain relevant and should be protected, but reimagining how they can be delivered in today's world. And that's our responsibility as those who seek to defend those international frameworks, to set out a vision for a better system, a fairer and a safer system, if we want to see those frameworks endure for another 75 years.
Thank you so much, Beth. I remember about 6 months ago when you attended an event by us, and you rightfully corrected us when we said we need to provide safe and legal routes. And by definition, refugees are legal. It's about making sure that they have the safe and fair routes to reach here. Um, I was going to open it up for questions from the audience, but I am actually going to use my moderator's privilege and just ask a follow-up question to Hamidullah and Abdallah, which is probably the same question. And then I've got also one for you, Beth. But Abdallah and Hamidullah, if you could briefly tell us, you both left family, friends, networks back home. Have you been able to be in touch with them? How does adjusting to a new life in the UK fit within worry to your family and loved ones back home? Abdallah, if you want to go ahead first.
Yes, thank you again, Maya. Yes, when I come to the United Kingdom, actually 2 decades ago, when was the first genocide in Darfur in 2003, 2004, and 2005. That was the first genocide that we imposed against us by the Janjaweed and the previous al-Bashir dictatorship government. Actually, yes, when I come at that time, I missed my family a lot, and the challenges is how to move from the old style of the life that we adapt to, which was socially is very tight than the United Kingdom here, and we are living as the one family, as all the people in the group and those things. When we come here, is a new community, new language, and the new culture. Actually, it's very difficult to adapt that. But the good thing that we started to study English, and then later we went to the university, which is the culture of the student is much better than the others' culture. So we quickly adapt with the system and fit in with the community at that time. Also, I realized that refugee and in the West, and in particular in the United Kingdom, they contribute hugely to the community in terms of the culture and in terms of the social life. If we just take example of the Holocaust and the Jewish people, the contribution, one day I told Maya that your struggling and your successful of the life need to be case study and they learned. They contribute to whole world economic, not just UK. So yeah, if we take from that part, I think a refugee they are contributing to the society in anywhere in any community they left, not just they are rely on the government and the system and the live with. I believe, yeah, that is my contribution in this part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdallah. Hamidullah, are you able and willing?
Hamdullah hacım, avazınızı eşitemsiz. Avazınızı eşitelemsiz. Mikrofon hazır takaq turdu. Bu suali hazır şu siz muşu Angliyaga kelgenden keyin aileniz bilen alaqlasha alamsiz. Yani burunqi özünüzün tatqan japalarınızga qaraganda hazırqi hayat, yani Angliyadagi hayatınız da qiyinchiliklar qaysi jihatlardan qiyinchiliklar bo'ldi, shuni tushuntirib bergan bo'lsangiz bo'libmi? Biz hozirgi shu ahvolimiz.
Ee, Mening vatan bilan aloqam qat'iy yo'q. Men burunma aloqalashamagan shu 2016-yil 7-oydan keyin. Hozirgachilik aloqalashamaganlik vatan bilan. Hamda ma Turkiyada 2 qizim bor, ular bilan aloqam bor. Lekin Saudiya turmida turgan chag'imda 5 yil aloqalashamadim. 5 yil har qanday jinoyatchi aloqalashdi ekan, lekin Saudiya hukumati bu Çin bu aloqalashtirmanglar dedi deb Saudiyadagi qizlarim bilan aloqalashib qo'ymadi. Ammo yerda hozir telefonda aloqalashib turyapmiz. Bu yerning ahvolini deb kelsak, bu yerda hamda hozir hech qanday qiyinchilik yo'q, qo'rqinish yo'q, ansiraydigan ish yo'q, xotirjam turyapman.
Til jihatdan, boshqa jihatlardan qanday qiyinchiliklar?
Til jihatdan mayada mulozimatchilarning ichida mehmonxonada arab bor ekan, men arab til bilgandan shuning bilan paranglashib bo'yotdi, lekin men shu til o'rgangim bor edi, bu o'tirim chiqmagandan keyin, qabul chiqmagandan keyin men bu bir kurs ko'rib til o'rganish imkoniyatim bo'lmayotdi. Hozir shu tilda qisqilyapman, tilda qiynalyapman shu. Til qiyinchiligi bor.
Rahmat. I've lost contact with my family members back home in East Turkestan since July 2016. There's no way I can reach them. I have 2 daughters in Turkey. I can communicate with them over the phone. But during my time in prison in Saudi Arabia, 5 years, I was unable to contact anyone because other prisoners were allowed, but somehow I learned that the Chinese government put pressure on the Saudi police that I shouldn't be given any privilege to contact anyone. So during my time in prison for 5 years, I didn't contact anyone. I was unable to. As for my life here in UK, despite all the difficulties regarding language, but I feel safe. That is the most important. And I'm happy that at least I am safe and a lot of time I rely on people who is staying at the same place with me, who speaks Arabic, because I speak Arabic, and they help with my communication. And I really hope that I can start learning English so then I can manage my life here. The most difficult obstacle for me is the fact that I cannot speak the language. That is hard.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad for you that the sense of safety is something that you feel that you have here in the UK, and I really wish, and I'm sure everyone here on the call wishes that you will soon be able to be in touch with your family back in East Turkestan. Beth, you said that the solution is a safer, fairer, and more cooperative system. What is the appetite today, both in the UK but also on an international level, for that type of cooperation that you're suggesting?
So I think we have a real divide growing within the international community. There's a growing number of countries that I think are effectively pulling out of the Refugee Convention, even if they are not formally withdrawing from the Refugee Convention. And that's partly because the convention itself, doesn't have its own court. And it is not considered as sort of as binding on things that countries want to do as other human rights articles. But, countries like the US have effectively withdrawn, the right to asylum in the US and other countries. But I do think you have social democratic governments in Europe still. And also, let's remember in the global south, the system does not work well or fairly either for those signatories, those who are signatories of the convention, who I do think support improvements to the system. And you have, in the UK, a government that I do think can be convinced of the need and is becoming more and more convinced of delivering asylum in a very different way. And that's partly for negative reasons, partly because of the political pressure they're under around, the issues of irregular migration and from the right, but also, who are still signed up to and believe in the rule of law and the post war, post 45 frameworks and human rights frameworks that we have, and are trying to defend them in the face of a rising tide of far right populism. So I think there's a growing divide in the international community, but I also believe that we are at the stage where it is becoming increasingly, if we don't do this, the system is going to unravel, and de facto most countries will be withdrawing in terms of their actions from the protection framework.
Thank you. I'm not sure if that, I'll take it as a 50-50 hopeful, yes, extremely challenging policy or journey still. We have a few minutes, and there was a question from the audience to Beth. You mentioned the right to citizenship has been changed for those who arrived irregularly by boat or lorry. Is this change for the newcomers, or does it apply to everyone?
So it changed for those who arrived after it was for anybody who arrived after the policy was introduced, and I believe the policy was introduced in about June or July last year. So for anyone who arrived after that policy was introduced, they effectively, that right was withdrawn. You are still allowed to apply, but there is essentially a presumption that if you arrived by lorry or by boat, there's a presumption in the regulations that mean that you're unlikely to be granted citizenship on the basis of your method of arrival. So if you've been in the country if you arrived in the country I think it was June or July 2025, you do still have access to citizenship.
Thank you. Any other questions for Abdallah, Hamidullah, or Beth? Raise your virtual hand, or you can write it on the chat. Otherwise, I will say that adjacent to the debate on asylum, there is going to be now a debate in the House of Lords on both a genocide determination bill and atrocity, and creating an atrocity crime database. And we're really hopeful that through these debates, some of the arguments that Renee Kassan put through, and we know that other partners have, in terms of the connection between providing asylum and safety as an atrocity prevention mechanism, is critical, exactly to prevent atrocity and for the UK to uphold its legal obligation, let alone its moral obligation on the matter. This has been a phenomenally emotional and informative way to spend the last almost 1.5 hours in our lunch and learn. I want to thank Hamidullah, Abdallah, and Beth. Hamidullah, I wish you a quick and decisive immigration decision. Abdallah, I know that you and the Darfur Association do incredible work when it comes to making sure there is international accountability for all the perpetrators for the ongoing genocide. So we are your friends, we are your allies, and we will support you in that work. And Beth, I wish you success in driving the required policy changes that we need. And
Hamdullah
again,
efendim, sizge köp rahmet bugün qo'shilganligingiz uchun. 1,5 soatdek vaqt bu yerda biz bilan birga qo'shilib, nihoyatda muhim o'zingizningki beshingizdan kechirgan ahvollarni so'zlab berdingiz. Sizga ko'p rahmat aytaman.
Rahmat, sizlarga rahmat. Meni bu suhbatga qabul qilib, mening ahvolimni bu anglag'iniga va boshqalarga yetkazganiga buning ko'p rahmat aytaman.
I would like also express my gratitude to you and to people who listened to my speech and showed some concern and care to what is happening to me and to my people. Thank you.
It's a real privilege, Hamidullah, to have you speak with us today. And to those of you who had joined us, I also want to thank you for taking the time and hearing the stories, the challenges, and identifying opportunities where you can also affect change. Many opportunities provided through Renekasan. So I will encourage you to join our newsletter, become a member and supporter. We will have other similar events. All these links are now shared on the chat. Future events, informative events, other opportunities to really lend a hand and make a difference, and become a friend of Renekasan in making the case for human rights in the UK. Thank you very much again, Beth, Abdallah, Hamidullah, and I wish everyone a good rest of the day and happy Refugee Week. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye
Köp
bye.
rahmet.
Thank you.
Yani ayrılsanız bulacağından köp rahmet.
Ma'qul rahmat. Ma'qul rahmat.